Let me welcome you to Ratio Christi. Ratio Christi stands for the Reason of Christ. We are a Christian-based group that looks at the evidences of Christianity and help you know why you believe what you believe. This spring, we're doing a series called Foundations. The first thing we're going to do is look at the Old Testament timeline. You really can't have a good grasp of the New Testament and what it means for a New Testament believer if you don't have a decent handle on the Old Testament. And most Christians, in general, don't have a good handle on the Old Testament. And that's why we're handling this today. All right, so most of you were raised in Sunday school, I bet, and you were told stories like David and Goliath, Jonah and the whale, Daniel and the lion's den, and so on. But you may not have been told, really, where does it fit in the bigger picture? You have these small pieces that don't really seem connected to each other. And my goal for tonight is for you to see all those stories that you remember from your childhood, as well as church today, as part of a larger story that is actual history. We're not going to cover the pre-Abrahamic time period in much detail tonight, and our real focus is going to be from the Abrahamic period on down to the post-exile period. For the pre-Abrahamic period, we pretty much have Adam and Eve, which goes down to the fall of mankind. Now, no one really knows where Adam and Eve lived. Some people speculate that it was near Jerusalem. It's a rabbinic tradition, but no one really knows. Because of the flood, there's no real way of identifying it. I've made this timeline for you. We're going to keep referring back to it, and I have it in 500-year increments. The first period is the Abrahamic period, followed by the Exodus and Conquest period, then the Kingdom period, then finally the Exile period and the post-exile period. So in the Abrahamic period, we're probably all familiar with the story of Abraham, where he was called, he lived in Ur of the Chaldees, he moved to Haran, and then traveled to Egypt for a while, and then eventually settled near Sodom and Gomorrah, where his nephew Lot got into trouble, had to rescue him, and that's more or less where the story ends. Abram was his original name. He was renamed to Abraham. At Sodom and Gomorrah, we have Lot and his wife. Abraham then has Ishmael. Later on, Abraham has Isaac, and then we're all familiar with the attempted sacrifice of Isaac. So to see where all this happened, Ur of the Chaldees is right over here, and I'm using straight lines because we're really not sure what direct path they took, but he eventually made up to Haran, and then he was told to go on down to the Promised Land, which this would be the Promised Land. I'm not sure if he knew about that at the time, but I'm pretty sure he did. But eventually he made his way to Egypt, where we know he lied about Sarah being his wife. Really, it's his half-sister, so it's a half-truth. And then he made his way back over here, and right about here is where Sodom and Gomorrah is. Hopefully this gives you kind of an idea of what a large area he had to travel to go away from his home to trust God to go to a new land that's been promised to him. Now, in this box right here, if we zoom in, we have Sodom and Gomorrah. Here's the Dead Sea, and I believe this is the Sea of Galilee. So with the Dead Sea in Jerusalem and the major area within Israel, this little ridge in the mountain range is where archaeologists believe Sodom and Gomorrah is. Now, with the Abrahamic period, dating it, the closest we can get is it's roughly 21st or 20th century. What I'm labeling the Abrahamic period goes up until about the 15th century BC. In this time period, Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau, the twins. Jacob marries Rachel and Leah after being fooled by their father, so he had to end up marrying both of them. We have the story of Jacob's ladder. We have, near the end of Jacob's life, Jacob reconciling with Esau and eventually moves away. And Jacob is renamed Israel. Israel, or Jacob, has 12 sons. Of the 12 sons, we have Joseph. He's the second youngest. You might be familiar with him, coat of many colors. Joseph is sold into slavery because his brothers are jealous of him, and he eventually rises to power. Israel's family moves to Egypt during a famine in the land, which Joseph was given a vision and foresaw that it was going to happen and help the Egyptians prepare for it. Eventually, Joseph dies many years after his family moves to Egypt, and there's a new Pharaoh on the scene that doesn't know Joseph and sees the power and might of the Israelites and how they're reproducing so quickly and puts them into slavery. And we have the period of slavery for them. Moses being raised by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses kills the Egyptian and flees to Midian. I'm sure most of you that are familiar with the stories of Joseph and Moses are familiar with all this. But just in case you're a newer believer or just aren't as familiar, hopefully this kind of helps put things in order for you. So that pretty much ends the Abrahamic period. And it's probably the period that we know the least amount about. So things are going to start picking up after this. But once we get to the Exodus period, we have a lot firmer dates and we have a lot more collaborative external evidences. Because for a lot of the things that we're dating, we're having to use both biblical and extra-biblical sources, like other nations talking about Israel and when they interacted with them. So if we were to zoom in on this period of the Exodus and the conquest, we're going to see that the Exodus itself happened in 1446 BC. 40 years later, the conquest happens. Then people will argue whether 7 years later, which would be about 1398, or somewhere around 1350, the Judges period begins. And then there's this long period of the Judges that eventually ends with Saul being anointed king. And I put this at the end of this time chart just so you can kind of see the scale. Because one of the difficulties in reading the Old Testament is it's written so rapidly that a lot of times you can just kind of lose the sense of time. You know, so-and-so lived 40 years and begot so-and-so. Or they dwelt in the land 400 years in this. And when it just says that, you hear it, but you don't really feel it. And seeing it on a chart like this really helps bring scale to it, I think. So within the Exodus and conquest period, which happens from the 15th to 11th century BC, we see the major events of Moses and the burning bush, the 10 plagues in Egypt, the Passover, the Exodus itself, and the crossing of the Red Sea. Now the crossing of the Red Sea is really interesting. If we go back to our map, we'll zoom in on the Sinai Peninsula. And this past spring, last year, we actually watched a video that made a very compelling case that Mount Sinai is not here where most Bible maps put it, but it's actually over here. And there's a lot of good reasons to believe that. And there's actually not many good reasons to believe that Sinai is actually right here. And I can give you a number of reasons why. But for now, just know that the Israelites left here, traveled across the Sinai Peninsula, had the Red Sea crossing. And technically, the Red Sea's down here, but these two gulfs are considered part of the Red Sea. This is technically called the Gulf of Aqaba. And eventually, Jebel el-Lawz is the modern name of the mountain that many people call Mount Sinai today. As we're looking at this Exodus and conquest period, they stay at Mount Sinai for about 40 years because they sent the spies out to Canaan. They didn't think they could really conquer the land, and God punished them for not believing him. Plus, Moses disobeyed, and so he wasn't allowed to go to the promised land. So we have several things going on here in this period. Balaam and the donkey. We have the 40 years in the wilderness, and then the conquest period begins in roughly 1406 BC. The conquest itself has 3 campaigns to it. There's a central campaign, a northern campaign, and a southern campaign. And I'm not going to go into all the details for you. Just the main thing is Jericho was burned, and archaeology has confirmed that that was burned, as well as Ai. And the other cities that weren't mentioned as burned in the Bible have no evidence of being burned. So the Bible has been, once again, collaborated to archaeology, which to me is really cool. Just always seeing how well it correlates and actually seeing the evidence of those events happening. But we have the story of Rahab the harlot at Jericho, as well as them circling the city several times for several days, and eventually doing the trumpet call that causes the walls to fall down. So that's where that story fits in. Southern campaign. So if you want to look at where the conquest happened, remember Mount Sinai is about down here. So they traveled north, and when we zoom in, we'll see they came up over here and went to Jericho first, and up to Bethel, and then they did a northern campaign, and then they came back and did the southern campaign. If you've ever heard of the 12 tribes of Israel, if you're not quite sure what that meant, so Jacob had 12 sons. If you notice here, we have 12 tribes, but each of his sons did not get land. Levi became the nation of priests, and they did not get land, at least not a region like this. They actually they were allowed to have cities instead, so that they could help with the sacrifice with the people, as well as acting as priests. So to have 12 tribes, Joseph had 2 sons, and so Manasseh and Ephraim each got land to themselves. And that's how we have these 12 regions for the tribal lands. And so after the conquest, they were able to occupy their land. And that pretty much wraps up the conquest period. Moving on to the Judges period. And this has a lot of ambiguity to us. I think a lot of people think, okay, we know about Moses, we know about the conquest, then there's a king somewhere. And we kind of forget about that area in between. The Judges period is pretty neat, where, first of all, judges were military leaders chosen by God. They weren't kings per se. There could have been more than one judge at a time, and most of them were judges to a region. So they didn't have widespread jurisdiction. pretty much God used judges whenever another people group came in and tried to harm the Israelites. So a judge would come up, be a military leader, and help them defeat their enemy. And then they'd kind of go back to doing whatever they were doing before. And they weren't particularly holy people, like you would think a priest would be. They were just people God used at the time. It covers a period of 200 to 350 years. One of the reasons we don't really know how long it took is because we don't have a lot of the indicators that we have in other sections of the Bible of so-and-so lived so long and had so-and-so, and being able to collaborate that to a judge at the time. And since some of the judges overlapped, you can't say, well, this judge ruled 40 years, this one ruled 10, therefore you have 50 years. Well, if they overlapped, it might have been the same 40-year period. Adds to the difficulty. But we had 12 judges. Probably the most known ones are Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, of Samson and Delilah. Also during this period, you have the story of Ruth, who married Boaz. Ruth traveled with Naomi. And interesting point, this story happened kind of right before Saul became king, because Boaz, who married Ruth, had Obed. Obed had Jesse, and then Jesse had David, King David. So we're starting to connect these stories a little bit more. Also during this time period, we have the prophet Eli, who had the two no-good sons, and then Samuel was raised with them, and he actually became the new prophet. So Samuel is the one who anoints both Saul and David, and that brings us to the kingdom period. Now the kingdom period is quite a long time. We have both the united kingdom and the divided kingdom. When we break this down, we'll see King Saul started his rulership around 1050 BC. 40 years later, we have King David, and then 40 years later, we have King Solomon. In King Solomon's time, he built the temple. After King Solomon, we have King Rehoboam in the southern kingdom and King Jeroboam the first in the northern kingdom. And that the nation split around 930 BC. Also on this time chart, just kind of for scale, we have King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, the prophet Elijah and Elisha, prophet Jonah, Isaiah, when Israel is conquered by Assyria, the prophet Jeremiah, and Babylon conquering Judah. And all the dates are attached. So when we're looking at each of these periods, we can see that God really only used the United Kingdom for about 120 years. And it was really because of Solomon. Even though he had the wisdom, he didn't have the faithfulness. And if you're familiar with his story, you'll know that God judged him, but because of God's covenant with David, God wanted to keep the line of David. When the nation is divided, in the north we have Israel. In the south we have Judah. And it gets kind of confusing because we're used to calling the United Kingdom Israel. So whenever we talk about Israel, we're either talking about the entire kingdom, the northern half, or the person that's named after, or the entire people group, the Israelites. Major events during King Saul's life, we have David and Goliath. Under King David, we have the Bathsheba event. And then under King Solomon, who built the temple. Under the divided kingdom, it lasted from 930 to 586 BC. Israel the north, first king Jeroboam. Elijah was contemporary to Ahab and Jezebel. And actually, if you read his story, you'll remember that after the event at Mount Carmel with the confrontation with the prophets of Baal, he ran away. And he was, oh, woe was me all of a sudden, even though he just had this major victory against the prophets of Baal. And Jezebel hated him. She wanted him dead. And so he had a pity party in Mount Horeb. And it says he went down south to Mount Horeb. Well, Mount Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. So if you actually read the event, it strongly indicates that Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia, where we saw it on the map, and not in the Sinai Peninsula, where most people put it. So just kind of interesting tidbit there. Elisha served right after Elijah. Jonah served during Jeroboam too. So in this time frame, we don't know specifically what years he served. We just know he's contemporary to Jeroboam. For Jonah's trek, we don't know where the whale or fish. It just says a great sea creature, probably a fish of some sort. But if you remember, he was serving down here, and when God called him to go to Nineveh, which is right about here, he went the other way. And he chartered a boat and left, and eventually got spit out on the shoreline somewhere. And the Bible says it took him 3 or 4 days to travel to get over here to finally tell them that they're going to be judged in 40 days if they don't repent. All right, so now further along with the divided kingdom, we have Judah in the south. We were just talking about Israel in the north. So with Judah in the south, their first king was Solomon's son, Rehoboam. He ruled from 930 to 913 BC. Isaiah ministered in Judah's royal court from 740 to 690 BC. And then Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, ministered unto Judah during Judah's last 40 years, which was 627 to 586 BC. So this is how they all fit into the timeline. You can see there's quite a bit of gap between a lot of these events. But there's also a lot going on between them that we're just ignoring. All right, so here's our big map again. We're going to zoom back into the Promised Land and see the northern kingdom. This is Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. Judah was able to keep Jerusalem as the center of worship. That's where the temple was. Israel made Samaria their capital, and that's where they started worshiping God from and doing their sacrifices. Although, as we know throughout the Israelites' history, pagan worship, worshiping false gods, and bringing in other religions was a recurring problem for them. So they had many worship centers, especially as time went on. So with the divided kingdom, we have Israel is actually conquered in 722 BC. So only about 200 years after the kingdom splits. If we look back at this map kind of looks like the map we just had. Here's Jerusalem, here's Samaria. The northern kingdom is conquered by Assyria, and Assyria takes up all of this region at this point in history. And they were very strategic. When they deported the Jews, they dispersed them. They did not want them to keep their culture. So they sent them to Haran, to Assur, all these different areas to make sure that they got filtered into society. They could not keep their identity separate. And many people reference them as the lost tribes of Israel because a lot of people don't know what happened to them. Then, in 586 BC, Babylon conquers Assyria as well as Jerusalem. So this entire region, plus maybe Egypt, is all under Babylonian control. And there's actually 3 deportations that lead to the final exile in 586. One of the things that kind of threw me off was there's actually 3 exiles, or 3 deportations for the southern tribe, or for the southern kingdom. And so I had to break it down to really know what happened so I could teach it well to my students. So what happens is, in 608 BC, Babylon captured Jerusalem. They take a lot of young men, including Daniel, the prophet, or the man that's going to become the prophet. In 597, just about 10 years later, Nebuchadnezzar attacks Jerusalem again, partly because Jerusalem isn't being a good servient, a vassal state to them. And so they take Ezekiel, King Jehoiachin, and the nation's treasure. So at this point, the temple, all of its treasures are removed. And Zedekiah is set as a king, and he rules for about 10 years. Then in 586, because of Zedekiah's rebellion, Judah falls to Babylon. And they conquer Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, they tear down the walls of the city of Jerusalem. All the able-bodied people were taken, the temple's even burned, and only a few people were left, just very few, just the infirmed that couldn't travel, the old and infirmed, and then a few people to take care of livestock. And that's it. So now we're into the exile period. Now when we zoom into the exile period, we see that it only lasts about 70 years. Babylon captures Jerusalem in 608, and then we have this huge gap where the book of Daniel takes place for the most part. And then over here in 538, Babylon is conquered by Persia, by Cyrus the Great, and the Jews are allowed to rebuild the temple. So let's get into this. All right, so I said I wasn't going to go into a lot of controversies, but this is one that I just thought was kind of interesting because I didn't know about it until I was preparing for this. Jeremiah has a prophecy that for 70 years they're going to be put in exile for their sin. That's Jeremiah chapter 25. In 608, Daniel is exiled. In 539, Persia defeats Babylon, and in 538, King Cyrus decrees that people are allowed to go back to their homeland to worship their gods. And so this is actually a 70-year period. This starts off the clock. Then in 538, the temple rebuilds. And when they were rebuilding the temple, only a couple thousand people go back at that time. It's not a huge exodus from Babylon back to Jerusalem. So people go back to build the temple, but the temple's not completed until 515. And it's at that time that a lot of Jews return home. So a lot of people consider this a 70-year period. Why? Which is right, which one's wrong? I don't know. I just know this is one's more commonly referred to as a 70-year period. Okay, so from 586 to 515 BC, we have Daniel, and in his lifetime, he's thrown in the lion's den. His buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whose Hebrew names are right here, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I probably totally mispronounced that, but I gave it a try. They were thrown in the fiery furnace, so we're all familiar with this story. So we're starting to get a time frame when this happened. And then also the expression, the writing on the wall, originates from the story of Daniel in this period. Post-exile period comes up next, and when we look at that, it gets a lot more detailed. In 538, Babylon is conquered by Persia. The Jews are allowed to rebuild the temple. King Cyrus of Persia dies in 530, and King Cyrus II is Cyrus the Great. Just in case you notice, right before him is King Cyrus I in their dynasty listing. Cambyses II becomes king of Persia in 530. He then dies, and Darius becomes king of Persia in 522. The work on the temple is renewed in 520. So even though they go back to the land around 538, building gets stalled, and they really don't get the project really underway until 520. And then 5 years later, they finish the temple. Then, way over here in 486, Xerxes I becomes king of Persia. And he's the one that Esther marries. You have the prophet Malachi serving around 470. You have Artaxerxes I becoming king of Persia in 465. And we really don't know how long Xerxes was king before he disposed of his wife and married Esther. There's no real indication. We just know that it's in this time frame. Ezra helps with worship at the temple. So Ezra's story really picks up here. And then that's 458. And in 445, Nehemiah's comes in to help rebuild the wall. For some reason, I always thought that after the decree of Cyrus is when it happened. I didn't realize that they went back, rebuilt the temple first, and then probably, 60 years later? They finished in 515, 445, so about 60 years, 70 years. 70 years later is when Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. That's quite a while, and I just had that out of order in my mind until I, put it all together like this. And one of the things that will throw you off is if you read Ezra and Nehemiah, they keep referencing the different kings. And the reason is, one, the kings keep changing, and two, it's not until like halfway through Ezra and about chapter 6 or 7 of Nehemiah, they actually get to Ezra and Nehemiah's time frame. The rest of it is kind of backstory where they're kind of giving the history of what happened up until now, and then they tell you what's happening in their lives after that. Post-exile period, 538 to the 5th century BC. In 538, and really the Jews keep going back to Jerusalem in waves, and a lot of them, probably a bulk of them, didn't even go back home. Because if you think about it, they've been in Babylon, which is way across the map, way across this map. You see this distance here. Traveling it by foot or by small animal. Horse. I consider that a small animal compared to a car. Squirrel. Yeah. Squirrel on each foot, balancing. Yeah. But a lot of them just got assimilated into the culture. They just wanted to stay there and not worry about going back to the temple. Especially if you're raised there. If you were born right after your family moved there, that's all you knew. And you're an old man now or old woman, and do you really want to go to this foreign land? All right, so from 538 to 5th century BC, Esther marries Xerxes, king of Persia. Malachi ministered from about 470 to 460 BC. He served just before the time period of Ezra and Nehemiah. He even prophesied that Elijah would come to call the people to repentance just before the day of judgment. And Malachi is, the last book in the Old Testament. And it's setting up the theological stage for the expectation for the Messiah. So when you finish reading the Old Testament and you read Malachi, you know that they're anticipating the coming Elijah, who we now know is John the Baptist, who filled that role. With Ezra, one of the neat things, and when you're reading Ezra and Nehemiah, it keeps referencing the 8th year or the 2nd year or the 20th year. And because we know when these other kings ruled, it's really easy to place when these events happened. So I really encourage you, read Ezra and Nehemiah sometime this week and just look at all the time references in there. It's really neat how thorough it is, especially when it's mentioning King Darius at one point and King Artaxerxes at another point. All right, so that's more or less the entire Old Testament in under half an hour. Cool, huh?